Thousands of flights already canceled, tens of thousands of travel plans delayed for days or maybe canceled forever. The FAA is working around the clock to restore service, but says the Air Traffic Control Center in Aurora won't be fully operational until October 13th. The massive disruption was caused Friday by a suicidal contract employee, reportedly with a grudge to settle. The Naperville man made his first court appearance today and expressed his regret. Meanwhile, the head of the Federal Aviation Administration ordered a 30-day review Monday of safety and security at the facilities. And Senator Dick Durbin wants an investigation into how the man was able to sabotage the Regional Control Center and bring Chicago's 2 airports to a screeching halt. Here now with some insights are Deborah Hersman. She is the former head of the National Transportation Safety Board from 2009 to 2014, now the president and CEO of the National Safety Council. Phil Rogers, who has been covering this story for NBC5 News and is an expert in reporting on aviation. And Rob Mark, a commercial pilot and publisher of Jetwhine, that's spelled JETWHINE.com. Before becoming a pilot in the late 80s, he spent 10 years as an FAA tower and radar controller around Chicago. We extended invitations to the FAA, to the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, and the Chicago Aviation Commissioner. All of them turned us down. Welcome to Chicago Tonight.
Thank you.
Rob Mark, let me start with you. Just describe for us, if you will, what Aurora Air Traffic Control does and why it matters.
Well, air traffic control at the center handles what we call the en route traffic, and it's usually the airplanes that have departed from any of the local airports and are up through maybe 10,000 feet and up into the high altitude structure up as high as 50,000 feet. And the same thing coming down. They kind of funnel them into the major Chicago airports, and then once they get down to the 10, 12,000 feet in the descent, they turn them over to O'Hare and then they guide them to the runway.
So, Phil, what exactly happened on Friday?
You had this gentleman, he went in at about 5:06. That's when they showed that he used his key card to get into the building. He got into an area where he had been working on a daily basis because he was a contract employee for Harris Electronics, which is working with a big contract for the FAA. He got in there and started fires in numerous locations, and then when the fire department arrived, they found him on the floor having already injured himself and attempting to slash his own throat. The problem is that he knew the infrastructure very intimately. It was what he worked on, if you will. He knew how to fix it, so thus he knew how to damage it as well.
What seems unbelievable, Deborah Hersman, is the fact that, as we understand it, the system sat right beside the backup system, so they both went down. Nobody really plans to put a backup system on top of a system, do they?
Well, you know, I think there are a lot of questions here about redundancy, and it's about equipment redundancy, but also the human beings too, and what equipment that they are trained to operate on, what they're familiar with. And now what we have is a situation where many of these en route controllers have been dispersed out to other neighboring facilities. This facility actually controlled that high altitude traffic for about 5-state area, and so it's really important to be able to have that continuity of operations. They're struggling right now.
They clearly are, but this could have been, correct me if I'm wrong, a catastrophe. Is that right?
It could have been a lot worse. If the weather had been worse, I think we would have seen the delays compound pretty quickly. And that has been the only saving grace, in addition to the controllers that were there to try to pick up the load in the other locations, as Deb said. I mean, that's so important that we realize that they're not trained. I should say they're trained to deal when the primary system goes down, you go to the backup. But when they both go down, that's probably not something they had a whole lot of preparation for. And I think they did a pretty darn good job over the last few days.
Because nobody was killed or injured.
No, and the controllers are doing an amazing job right now. They're being sent into places where they don't normally work. There's no playbook for this. But one of them pointed out something really, really important to me today, and that was, yes, this was an act of sabotage, but this just as easily could have been an accidental fire. It could have been a tornado. It could have been something else that took out Chicago Center. The bottom line is, what did they learn out of this? They learned that they've got this this, here's one, here's one, here's one, and you take one out, and this one can't pick up the duties of the other one. And that's if you will, it's a flaw in the way the system is set up. Understand the flight plans burned up for all of the airline flights that are handled out of Chicago. So as a result, all of those are being entered now manually by good pilots like this one, and then all that has to be read back and everything. It's a really time-consuming process.
We went through 9/11, and before 9/11, we would later learn there had been plenty of concerns about the fragility or the vulnerability of this system. What part did we not understand enough to fortify the system in the last 13 years?
I think that's a great question, because when we look at this system and how interconnected it is, and we see just one facility going down in the country and the ripple effects that has across the whole nation, you really understand how extremely fragile and dependent this system is. But when you think about it, this is a system that is based on World War II era technology. This is ground radar. All of us walking around in our pockets or our purses, we have satellite-based communications with our GPS that's in our phones. If we want to move to a much more redundant, much more robust system, we have got to accelerate and support the path that's underway to move them to satellite-based control, not ground-based control, because we continue to be vulnerable with systems like this.
But haven't we had those conversations? I mean, is this a new conversation?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, over the weekend, the Department of Transportation's Inspector General put out a report that was very critical of FAA leadership in the sense of getting this new automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, ADSB we call it, system up and running. They've had it in the plan for a long time, and everybody that's on the operational side, aviation-wise, says, you know what, we're putting all this equipment in, FAA, how are we going to use it? How are you going to use this information? And FAA is not ready for that, and they don't seem to have much of an answer of exactly when they will be ready for that, and that's why everybody's just kind of wondering what else they're doing.
One of the ironies here is that he was in the building working on new technology, this massive multi-billion-dollar effort to modernize the FAA. He was one of the contract people that was doing that. And remember, he had been working in the building for 9 years.
And do we know anything about his background in terms of whether he went through any sort of psych profiles? We know there was a warning on Facebook, right?
Well, and it's interesting you should mention that, because as we reported tonight at 6 o'clock, going back to 1998, the GAO has been warning that security was not good enough in these facilities, especially for contract employees.
We're seeing the courtroom sketches here. He obviously didn't, I mean, he's well enough now to stand before a judge.
You know, Carol, there was a suggestion, and I don't know, I'm hardly an expert on security or much of anything else, but I mean, we spoke to one controller today who was saying, you know, in a missile silo, you never let one guy be in there by himself. You know, there's always somebody in, they're always at least in pairs. And he was asking, why would you have a person who doesn't work for the agency in one of the most sensitive areas and allow him to be in there by himself? I think that's one of the things they're going to start looking at.
Is there an issue between a contractor and a full-time employee here? I mean, is there an area to be explored on this?
Well, I would say that, you know, when we look at this situation, obviously it's unique to this individual, but workplace violence across the board is a huge issue in workplaces all across the country. And so this person was trying to do harm to themselves, but I would say we all have challenges when we look at how to manage our own workforce, what risks are present, whether you have one person on duty alone. But I think the other issue, too, is to look back and say, when we say we're looking for redundancy in a system, what are we talking about? Are we talking about emergency, backup, you know, redundancy? Or are we talking about 100% operation? Because if anything were to happen to this studio, could you, you know, replicate what you have here 100%? I'm not sure it's reasonable to expect that the FAA or any other work site or operation can replicate 100% if their main site goes down.
But it does raise the question of what's the difference between a terrorist and a saboteur?
Semantics. I mean, really, I mean, if they think that people weren't somewhat terrorized on Friday when they found out that an employee had done something, or even a contractor had done something to interrupt the air traffic control system for people that were going to fly, I bet there were an awful lot of frightened people. I mean, luckily it didn't turn out to be quite that bad.
Is the FAA proactive or reactive as a normal course of things?
She's the expert on this.
I think, Deborah, you would know the answer to that.
You know, I would say the FAA has a really difficult job to do, and so just prefacing that, they also have financing and funding challenges. They aren't necessarily treated like a business. When the sequester went into effect last year, the across-the-board cuts to the government, they took a hit. And so I think some of the questions that people have to ask is, are we going to be satisfied to get what we pay for? And some of this infrastructure, I think there's been a desire absolutely to accelerate the implementation. The question is, have the dollars been there over time, and can they count on that year to year to year without having interruptions? And so it is tough to implement these long-term infrastructure projects, and we have to, as a nation, prioritize them, because the delays like we saw this past weekend, that costs us millions of dollars.
The holiday season is almost upon us. It's coming fast. They say they're going to be up and running by October 13th. There's no reason necessarily to say that's absolutely a hard deadline, correct?
No, but at the same time, you've got to give them credit for one thing, and that is this fire took place on Friday, and 1,500 flights were canceled at O'Hare alone. Look today, they were back up to something, I think, in the area of 85 to 90% of operations, 95% at Midway. I mean, that's remarkable that they were able to ramp up, keeping in mind the Chicago Center is still closed. They did that by spreading people around to facilities that are not equipped to do the job that Chicago Center does. That's pretty amazing.
Deborah Hersman, Phil Rogers, Rob Mark, thank you so much for being with us
You're welcome.
on Chicago Tonight. We continue in a moment. Please don't go away.